About 23,000 years ago, in what is now New Mexico, someone walked across wet mud beside a shrinking lake, carrying a child on one hip. We know it was one hip. Every few dozen steps, the prints slip sideways, and the toes splay as the weight shifts. Then the prints stop. The child is set down. Two small sets of feet appear in the mud, wandering a little, and then vanish as the child is picked back up. That trackway is real. It runs about a mile across the playa at White Sands National Park, and Matthew Bennett's team described it in 2020. The walker was small. The feet suggest a young woman or an adolescent girl, and the mud shows she came back along nearly the same line within hours. On the return trip, there is no child. Whatever the errand was, she left her passenger somewhere and walked home with her arms empty. Between the outbound and inbound tracks, a mammoth crossed. So did a giant ground sloth, which seems to have paused and reared up, as if it caught her scent. The dating is contested. Bennett's team put the oldest White Sands prints between about 23 and 21,000 years ago, using seeds of a ditch grass. Critics said aquatic plants can absorb old carbon and read too old. In 2023, a team led by Jeff Pigati tested pollen and quartz grains and got the same answer. It's still argued over. But the century hardly matters here. What matters is the thing in her arms and the problem it represents. Because a human infant is uniquely bad at being carried. No other primate has quite this problem. Our babies, at birth, cannot hold on. A newborn baboon grips its mother's belly fur within minutes and rides there while she moves. A chimpanzee infant clings for months, leaving both her hands free. We lost the fur. And our babies arrive early and unfinished, with soft necks and weak hands, because a pelvis built for walking limits head size at birth. So the grip moved from the baby to the mother. Every hour she spent walking, she spent holding something that could not help her hold it. And the children kept coming, spaced out. Nancy Howell's demographic work with the Dobe San of Botswana, published in 1979, found births roughly 4 years apart. 4 years is a long carrying contract. Richard Lee, working with the same communities, tried to total the distance. Every foraging trip, every move of camp. His estimate was that by the time a child walked independently, its mother had carried it something like 4,000 to 5,000 miles. Not 8,000, thousands. Which raises the obvious question. How do you carry a 30-pound toddler that far, plus everything else you own, using 2 hands? The child was never the only load. There was water, firewood, a digging stick, ostrich eggshell containers, and whatever roots and nuts you gathered on the way. Camps move. In wet months, some foraging groups shifted every few weeks. In the dry season, they stayed near permanent water for months. Each move meant packing a household into what a few adults could physically hold. And on moving day, nobody carried more than a mother of small children. In 2007, Wall-Scheffler and colleagues measured the cost. Walking while holding an infant in your arms burned roughly a sixth more energy than carrying the same weight in a sling. A sixth. Across thousands of miles, that isn't a convenience. That is the difference between keeping up with your group and falling behind it. So a carrier isn't a nice invention. It's close to a requirement, which should make it one of the most common objects in the archaeological record. It is not in the record at all. Not one intact example. Not one fragment anyone can point at and say, this held a baby. To guess at what's missing, we borrow from the living. The ethnography is strikingly consistent about the solution, and strikingly varied about the material. In the Kalahari, it was the Kaross, a soft leather cloak over one shoulder that worked as a bag, a blanket, and a seat for a child on the hip. In the Arctic, Inuit women used the amauti, a parka with a deep pouch at the back where a naked baby rode against warm skin. In New Guinea, looped string bags carried produce one day and an infant the next. Bark cloth in the Pacific, wooden and woven cradleboards across North America, hide, bark, bast fiber, sinew, netting. Every one of those rots. In most soils, a leather sling is gone within decades, and plant fiber can go faster. James Adovasio, Olga Sofer, and Jake Page called this the invisible sex problem. An entire technology of string and skin, missing from the story we tell. Elizabeth Wayland Barber named the moment humans learned to twist fiber into cord the string revolution. She argued it mattered more than pottery and left almost nothing behind. Almost nothing isn't nothing. In 2020, Bruce Hardy and colleagues reported a 3-ply cord, twisted from conifer bark fiber, stuck to a flint tool at Abri du Marat in France. It is roughly 40 to 50,000 years old, and Neanderthals made it. 3 plies means deliberate spinning, a learned technique, not a lucky twist. At Zudzuana Cave in Georgia, wild flax fibers turned up in sediments about 30,000 years old. Some died. At Pavlov in Moravia, cordage left impressions in fired clay. So the capability existed tens of thousands of years before the oldest surviving cloth. People with 3-ply cord and a hide do not carry babies in their bare arms. There's one more shadow, and it lies on the babies themselves. At Sunghir in Russia, around 34,000 years ago, children were buried under thousands of mammoth ivory beads. The beads lie in rows and bands, tracing the outline of clothing that has rotted away, sewn onto caps, sleeves, and, some argue, onto wraps. At Upward Sun River in Alaska, 2 infants were buried together with red ochre and decorated antler rods about 11,500 years ago, described by Ben Potter's team in 2014. Nobody can prove those rods framed a carrier. It's one reading among several. But someone spent real hours making objects that went into the ground with 2 babies. So how far should we push this? Timothy Taylor pushed it about as far as it goes, in a 2010 book called The Artificial Ape. His claim is that the sling came first and made us. Carried babies could be born more helpless, brains growing on outside the womb, because a technology held them. I don't buy the strong version. It asks one unpreserved object to explain human brain evolution, and there is no way to test it against anything we can dig up. The weak version, I think, is close to certain. Once people were walking hundreds of miles a year with dependent children, some carrier was in daily use, everywhere. What the evidence genuinely cannot settle is what it looked like, who made it, whether it was decorated, handed down, or buried with the child it had carried. Which makes it, I'd argue, the most used tool in human history and the least visible. In hand every day for 100,000 years. If you have ever tied a length of cloth across your body and felt a sleeping weight settle onto your hip, that's the artifact. It never fossilized. It just kept being remade.